Hey, it's Mark Ferguson with Invest for More, and many of you know who follow my channel, we have a lot of crazy eviction stories, a lot of interesting tenants, and a lot of different things that happen to our rental properties. So I've talked a lot about this in my blog and written many articles about how we screen tenants, but I haven't gone through a full video on how we screen tenants for my YouTube channel. So I'm going to show you some of our properties, some of our more interesting evictions, and talk about what we do to screen tenants, how we try to avoid evictions, and how do we try to find some really good tenants. And a lot of people might think, oh, all your tenants are bad, why should we listen to you? And that's a good point. But I think 88% of our tenants are good. We have, over 70 tenants in commercial residential properties. So when you do see a bad one, it's not indicative of all of our properties, and you are going to have some bad tenants no matter how well you screen. And the other thing to consider is, we buy a lot of very interesting properties, just like the 8-plex I just bought that has 7 tenants. And a lot of our evictions are actually on inherited properties where we had previous landlords who maybe didn't go through the screening process like they should, or just threw people in there as fast as they could to try and get the rent up and sell it to someone like me. But we knew that going into the deal. So let's talk about exactly how we screen tenants, what we do, and also some huge red flags to look out for if you're thinking about renting to a potential tenant. Now, the first thing to know is that every state is different and every state has different laws. So always double check with your laws with an attorney, accountant, if you have specific legal advice. These are suggestions, things we might do, ideas. This is not specific advice on how to screen tenants or look for your own tenants, because state, local laws can all be so different. So make sure you're doing things legally. Realize if you're getting other advice from online, it might not be legal in your state or your area. So always check that. I'm in Colorado. Colorado has some very strict tenant laws they've been enacting over the last few years. And we'll talk about some of those as well. All right, so the first thing, don't just trust your gut when looking for tenants. So the house you're looking at now is one that was somewhat trashed. Ended up having bed bugs a couple times. The tenant stopped paying for a while. It wasn't a great situation. It could have been worse. But when I first bought my rental properties, and I bought my first rental property in 2010, I didn't do credit checks. I trusted my gut. I knew who a good tenant would be, right? Well, there are people out there who are professionals at tricking you into thinking they're a good tenant when they are not. So do a credit check, background check on everyone, because it is impossible to tell if someone's going to be a good tenant just by talking to them, because some tenants have learned what to say and what not to say to get people to trust them. At least some tenants. And like I said, most tenants are great, but the bad ones can really, really be bad and cost you a ton of money and make up for all the good ones. So when we do background checks, we do them through our property management software, which is DoorLoop or property management program. We've talked about that before. We can collect rent online through that. There's all kinds of different things we can do with DoorLoop. And we can just automatically have tenants apply online. They submit all their information without us seeing it, which is nice, because I don't want to see social security numbers, private information, things like that. And then they pay directly to DoorLoop. You can also do the same thing with TransUnion, some other property management software, programs, etc. So I think it's best if you can just have the tenants apply directly with one of these companies. You get the report, they pay directly, you're not handling money. Some states have kind of limited how you collect application fees, a lot of things like that. So we don't collect any kind of application fee. We just have the tenants pay directly. Eliminates any question of us overcharging or just trying to make money in that route, because we don't. A new law in Colorado also states that tenant must have access to that report. So if you do any kind of credit check, background check on a tenant, you have to give a copy of that to the tenant so they can use it for another rental if they want to. And that kind of makes sense, so that the tenant isn't, paying 10 different fees to 10 different property managers. They've got that one background check, credit check, as long as it's with a, I'm not sure what the rules are, but with a, reputable company, shows the right information, they can keep using that over and over. Now, what you see in that background check or credit check varies from tenant to tenant, and what is okay with you varies by landlord too. So there's no set rule in stone about what you should accept or not accept. Some people say you need a 600 credit score, some say you need a 700, some might say you need an 800. Who knows? Some states will try and dictate what you can do and not do. It can be a little tricky, so make sure you check your rules. Colorado wanted to dictate that you couldn't check credit on all tenants, but they limited that to just tenants who were using government aid, housing vouchers, things like that. You're not supposed to check credit or let credit impact your decision for those tenants. So what we do, and it varies, is we like to see at least a 600 credit score. Doesn't mean everybody who has a 600 gets in. That doesn't mean everybody who has a below 600 we won't rent to. It's just kind of one of the things we look at. Something else we look at is, background checks, criminal activity, if there's dangerous crime, that's obviously a big red flag, especially if we're in a multifamily and you have other tenants close by. You don't want to endanger your other tenants. But we also want to look for evictions or judgments or collections from property management companies, rental companies. So if we see an eviction, we see judgments for housing, that's a huge red flag, right? That's a huge red flag, probably not going to rent to them. Now, if someone has low credit, sometimes we'll work with them. We prefer not to, depends on the property, the situation, how many applications we have. We have used cosigners before. So what a cosigner is basically, let's say one tenant has a 550 credit score, but their friend or parent has a 700 credit score and they're willing to cosign, which means they take full responsibility for that tenant. Any late rent, any damage they do to the property, they're responsible. That does not guarantee you'll have a good tenant, though. A lot of times you'll find that cosigner maybe just wants that tenant out of their house. And they're willing to do anything and everything to get them their own place and take on that responsibility and know they're taking a huge risk and it might cost them some money down the road. Honestly, I think that happens more often than you think, especially with parents, especially parents with grown adult children who they're co-signing for. We've rented to a couple of them, and it usually does not turn out well. And we think the parents just wanted them out of the house and were willing to do anything and everything they could. Now we're able to, in some cases, place a collection against the parents. Not that they're easy to collect still, but it's a lot easier to collect against someone with a really good credit who might have some money than someone who has bad credit and no money. Another thing people often ask for are references. So when we are renting a property, we'll put it on Facebook, we'll put it on Zillow, we'll usually put a sign up, and we used to put it on Craigslist, don't really do that anymore, and we get quite a few applications. And we'll have people fill out actual physical application, and then they'll do the background check as well if the application looks okay. Well, you can ask for references on that application. Now, we do check references in some cases. Honestly, in a lot, we don't, because references can be pretty unreliable. They might help in some cases, but again, if someone is listing a reference, unless they're just really, really desperate, that reference is going to tell them that person is okay, right? If it's a previous landlord, they're probably going to say they're okay. This is another interesting property we had to do an eviction on. This was an inherited tenant, by the way. And it might be a landlord who wants to get rid of these people, and they want them out of there, so they're willing to say they're great. Although it could be a landlord, who's older, not older themselves, but, was renting to them longer ago in the past, not a current landlord. They might be more honest. So if you can find not their current landlord, but the landlord before that, that might be a much better indication of how they actually will be as a tenant, because that landlord's already gotten rid of them, good or bad, and is not as willing to maybe fib a little bit on their reference. Friends, family, most of them are going to say good things. If you find a reference who says bad things, that's a huge red flag, because either they're just too lazy to find someone good, or the best people they could find still could not give them a good reference. So references can be somewhat useful, but I definitely wouldn't place a whole lot of weight on those. Another thing to look at is how much money they make, because you want someone to rent from you who can afford to rent from you. And I know there's a lot of hoopla out there about, landlords take 80% of your income when you rent. Landlords do not want to do that. Landlords want to take 30 or less of your income when renting, because we know if we take more than that, there's a really good chance you can't afford it, you won't pay rent. No way do we want to take that large of a percentage of someone's income and rent to them. Now, what's interesting is some states like Colorado have come out and said, no, you can't make restrictions on, what their income can be. So, like I worded that differently, but Colorado said you can only limit income or deny someone if their income is less than 2 times the rent. So if the rent is $1,400 a month and they make $2,800 a month, you would have to accept them just based on that. You can't deny them because of that. A lot of landlords want to see 3 times the income. So some states are actually trying to make it harder on landlords and honestly harder on tenants if you're getting tenants in there who can't afford properties. From the state's eyes, they say, oh, we're making things easier because more tenants will be able to apply and get that property. But in the long run, it's probably not the greatest solution. Now, I'm saying all this, and if someone meets all these criteria, it doesn't mean you have to accept them. Maybe you have a tenant who's better and meets the criteria better, but you're supposed to state why you denied someone, what the reason was, and you need to make sure the reason you give is not illegal or against your state laws. So if you want to deny someone and you say, oh, it's because they only made 2 times the rent and we require 3 times. Well, if you're in Colorado, you can't do that because the law says it has to be 2 times or less. So those are things to remember. But just because a tenant meets all of these guidelines or all of these state mandated guidelines doesn't mean you can't have some stricter guidelines or stricter reasons or different reasons for why you deny them. So like I said, there's a lot of nuance to this. It can be lots of different reasons for things that happen. A lot of it just comes from experience in doing this. So it can be a little bit tricky. That is for sure. Now, let's say you have someone that maybe they don't have a cosigner, their credit's a little low, their income's a little low, you really want to rent to them. Should you do it? In a perfect world, no. But if you really, really want to do it, there's also some things you can do that maybe help increase your chances of them being successful, or at least getting your money back if something goes wrong. Typically, in most cases, you charge rent, you charge a deposit, and usually that deposit is 1 month's rent. Now, some places will charge first, last, and deposit, which means a tenant to rent a place has to pay the deposit, first month's rent, last month's rent. That's a huge chunk of money. You could buy a house for less than that in most cases. Well, Colorado made that illegal too. So you can't charge first and last. You can just charge first and the deposit. But you can increase the deposit. Now, again, look at your state rules. In Colorado, you're allowed to charge 2 times the rent for a deposit. So if your rent's $1,200, you can charge a $2,400 deposit. You can't go more than that, or it's illegal. So again, check your state laws. But that's one way to maybe protect yourself a little more if you have a tenant who maybe is on the fence, you're not sure about, or you really want to rent to, but the numbers say don't. You can increase the deposit. We've done that before, and honestly, usually you expect problems when you do something like that because the numbers and all of the indications show you might have issues. It's just that extra deposit might help take care of some of those issues, but we much prefer someone who's going to not have issues and have decent credit, etc. When we're pricing a property, when we want to rent a property to someone, we honestly don't try and get the absolute most we can. We try to go a little bit low, get more applicants, choose a really good tenant, as opposed to getting someone who's really desperate and willing to pay more because nobody else will rent to them. So be careful how you price your units, your properties, because that can have a big impact on the tenants you get as well. And you were looking at the apartment after we fixed it up after the eviction right there. Something else to consider is Section 8, housing vouchers. There's a huge push right now from online gurus to do Section 8, talking about how it's guaranteed income, nothing can go wrong, it's all awesome. Be very, very careful. We've done Section 8 on properties we've taken over. There are no guarantees, right? The government is not going to come in and pay back rent or cover eviction costs or repair your property if a Section 8 tenant damages it. Ask us how we know. There might be some cities, states that might help a little bit. It's going to be different in most areas, but we've had awful Section 8 tenants, and we had to repair, do everything. They lost their Section 8 ability to use those vouchers. That's about all that happened to them. I also was completely ripped off by one of those Section 8 gurus, And if you're wondering who it is, it's Tom Cruise, not Tom, the actor, a different Tom Cruise. But this happened well before he was doing Section 8. He actually tried to do some email work for my website, approached me, did some work. It was awful work. I said, nope, I'm good. He offered to work for free for a while. I said, oh, all right. We'll end up charging my credit card for 4 months for charges, almost, $8,000 that I never approved. Called him out on it. He said he'd refund it, sent me fake refund notices, never refunded me. Then he said he's insolvent and bankrupt. And eventually I caught him on Facebook claiming he had a new Ferrari driving around while his company was bankrupt and couldn't pay me that money. And then he blocked me, wouldn't ever respond to me, talk to me from that point forward. So just want to say watch out for that guy, and don't have any input on the other Section 8 gurus out there. But it is not a foolproof automatic system. Section 8, the government will help pay people's rent, a certain percentage. The government guarantees their portion of the rent, but the tenant has to pay the other portion. The tenant can also fall out of that program. Properties have to be inspected and approved for that program. It's not as easy as people make it out to be, and you still have to go through the same screening process as you would with any regular tenant, and be very careful with that. So, lots of things to think about here. Hopefully this helped. Another thing us landlords have to think about are pets and pet fees and ESA animals and things like that too. Colorado also has made some different laws. The federal government, HUD, has gone after landlords for breaking those rules, so you have to be very careful with that as well. So for pets, Colorado has limited. You can only charge $35 a month for pet rent, or 2% of the rent, or something like that. Again, always check your state law. So you can't just say, hey, we're going to charge you $100 extra a month if you have a dog in Colorado. It's limited to what you can charge. You also might be able to charge an extra deposit for the pet, but you can't make it non-refundable in Colorado. Before the last round of law changes, you could charge more pet rent. Now you can't. Now in the long run, I think that actually makes landlords not accept pets, because there's just not as much incentive to do it, and there's so much risk that can happen with pets damaging property. We see it all the time in rentals we have or houses we buy. So that's something to consider as a landlord. If someone has pets, cats can do an awful amount of damage. Dogs can do an awful lot of damage. In Colorado, you can't discriminate against big dogs or small dogs or different breeds either. So a lot of landlords just end up saying no pets, none at all, because the rules we have to go by if we allow pets just don't allow us to hedge our risks against a cat peeing everywhere, destroying the carpet, floorboards, everything, which can happen. So be very careful with pets. As far as the ESA pets go, there's so much different information out there, and I have another video that goes over it. But basically, if someone has a disability, they have a letter from a doctor saying they need an animal because of their disability, you have to allow it. It can be a cat, it can be a squirrel. If they've got a disability, a doctor confirms, and the doctor confirms they need an animal for that disability, you have to let them have it. Now, there's some rules regarding that. They have to tell you beforehand. They can't just get an animal and tell you later. They've got to inform you, let you know they're getting one. They should tell you before they apply on, if they're brand new, that they've got this animal already. Again, you can't deny them because of that animal, but if they've got bad credit, something else going on, you could deny them for those reasons. Now, if that pet is causing the landlord to make unreasonable accommodations, you can deny them, right? If they've got an elephant and you don't have a yard, you probably can't accommodate that elephant. Or if it's making life so awful for the other tenants, maybe you can't accommodate it because there's, a snake who's getting into other apartments at night and crawling around on your bed. That probably would be a reason to say you can't have your ESA anymore. Now, those are just some examples I made up, so please don't take those seriously. But there are some rules, some guidelines along there, and you cannot charge extra deposit or pet rent for ESA animals. So that is also something to consider and think about. Again, there's a lot of rules and regulations. As a landlord, you've got to make sure you're adhering to. Another really major thing to watch out for, and something that can be a huge red flag, is let's say you've got somebody who's gone through the process, they look really good, they're ready to sign the lease. We'll talk about the lease in just a little bit, but that's a whole nother video. And you say, okay, I just need your deposit. I need your first month's rent. And they say, oh, well, I want to move in on the 20th, so let's just prorate the rent for that. And I've got half the deposit now. I'll pay the rest on the first of the month. Huge red flag. If they can't pay you deposit, first month's rent before they move in, really good chance you're going to have problems. And they might just be trying to get in there because they know it's hard to get people out. You have to evict them. In some states, it can take months or longer to get them out. So make sure they can pay everything before you give them the keys. Make sure they aren't just trying to get on a payment plan right off the get-go. Huge red flag. Once you have someone rented, you should have late fees in the lease. Again, those might be regulated by your state on how much late fees you can pay, which we are in Colorado. We can only charge so much in late fees. But don't be afraid to charge late fees. Don't be afraid to be a stickler for the dates and rules and everything. If you give an inch, they will take a mile. We've seen this over and over again. But if you have rules, you stick to those rules. Tenants know you have those rules. It's a win-win for everybody. They know when things are due. They know there's no wiggle room. And amazingly, rent's usually paid on time. Things work out much better in those situations. As far as a lease goes, I highly recommend using an attorney or property management company if you're doing that. Have them create one for you first. You can go on different sites like Law Depot, LegalZoom, have them create one. They're even state specific. Again, they're not always guaranteed to be correct or have everything you need or meet all the most recent state laws, so make sure that's done. And again, if all this seems crazy and outlandish to you and ridiculous, you can always hire a property management company to do all this for you, right? You don't have to do all this yourself, but this is for people who decide to go this route on their own. Now, in your lease, again, you have to be careful. In Colorado, some landlords will say, if we catch you smoking, it's a $300 fine. If we catch a pet here, it's a $300 fine. You can't have fines in Colorado. You can't fine the tenants for different things in the lease. That is illegal. Some states you might be able to. Enforcing it isn't always easy. But your lease should very clearly, obviously, the rent, deposit, term, when the rent's due, late fees, things they can or can't do, what property is being leased, right? The premises, if it's confusing, if there's a garage, etc., all that. And again, I'm not going to go into the exact things you should have in a lease because that's really hard to do based on different state laws. And it's probably better to have a professional help you do at least your first one, and then maybe you can do them from there on if you feel comfortable doing that. So there's a lot to consider with tenants. And even if you're using a property manager, even if you're going to hand that off, it's good to know a lot of this too, to see or talk to your property manager, see what they do, see how they handle things, see if they are doing these things as well too. And I do have another video on how to choose a property manager and how to find a property manager as well. We have our own property management crew. So for us, they're kind of within my office. I don't do all this myself. It's kind of like having my own property manager, but we have more control, and I actually like it a lot better. If you're wondering about this house, this was a wholesale deal we bought, had to do an eviction because the seller wouldn't leave, and then now it's the police going through. We weren't sure if they're in there or not, and that was a crazy situation as well. Like I said, we have crazy eviction situations that aren't always tenants that we choose. I also have a video on how to avoid evictions, and hopefully even in bad situations, you don't always have to go through an eviction even if you have a bad tenant. That's something else to think about too. The worst case scenario you need to plan for, but hopefully you can avoid that in the long run. All right. I think that is everything I wanted to talk about. There was quite a bit there. Hopefully that gives you some tips, ideas, things to do. Oh, I know one last thing. This is very important too. Some of our evictions have been from long-term tenants who rented from us for years. So something to think about is just because you have a tenant who maybe was awesome the first few years, had no problems on their credit, etc. the first few years, if you've had that tenant for 5 to 10 years, when you should be renewing their lease. That's usually the best route to go. Doesn't hurt to raise rent too. I'm not saying you have to raise it all the way up to market rent, but you should be raising rent at least a little bit. You can always do another background and credit check for an existing tenant after a certain amount of time, especially if there's signs. The place is pretty dirty. Maybe they're not always, paying rent on time. Who knows? But if you're thinking about renewing it, doesn't hurt to say, hey, we're going to check your credit and background again, because maybe something happened. People change, their lives change. Who knows? There could be, a divorce, etc. So just because you had a really good tenant for a long time doesn't mean they'll always be good, and you can't just ignore them and hope things work out. Some of the worst houses I've seen were from long-term tenants, and the landlord just never checked on the property, never checked on the tenant, and the places were just destroyed. Okay, that's my last tip of the day. If you guys have any questions, comments, or want to add anything, please feel free. Hope you enjoyed this video. And of course, we'll have more videos on my actual properties. I'm sure we'll have more evictions at some point. We try to avoid them, but if you have enough properties, you will have them. We'll also be showing our flips, businesses, all of that as well coming up.